This attempt for this next hour, and I'm going to give plenty of chances for you guys to ask questions, is for me to throw a lot of information at you about Washington, D.C., or about the issues that are confronting Washington, D.C., a primer on government. And this is because I know when I started teaching here, I teach the media and politics class, and I've been doing this for about 10 years here. When I would mention terms like midterm elections or things that I thought, of course, everybody knows, a lot of people didn't. And some of these things are embarrassingly stupid that you might think, oh, for God's sakes, of course I know this. And others are going to be embarrassingly humbling in that you think you ought to know this, but you don't. And my point of doing this is really this. Washington is a place where people follow current events like crazy. My first week in Washington, I still remember being in a taxi back when those existed, and some cab driver saying to me, oh, that's so-and-so from the New Yorker. It's like, what? I have no idea what he's talking about, but these people follow this stuff. Cab drivers follow it. Certainly folks at your internship are following the campaign. They're following what's going on in the Trump administration. This is sort of the language of Washington. And while in California, you might say, oh, did you watch the debate last night? And 9 out of 10 people might say no. In Washington, 9 out of 10 people are going to say yes. So part of this is just to sort of get you up to date a little bit and to show you how you can stay up to date so that you might be able to sound like you know what you're talking about when it comes to your internships. So I'm going to try one more attempt here at sharing the screen, which had better work nicely. It will. And whoever is there with their mics unmuted, and by the way, feel free if you want to be on camera here, feel free to be off camera. It doesn't really matter. All the point, you can ask questions. I guess I'd ask if you ask a question, put yourself on camera, but I'm perfectly happy to have you guys go on camera now. Okay, I want to make sure that you guys are seeing what I'm seeing. So one more time I'm going to ask, is what you're seeing issue 1 paid internships?
We are seeing a screen with all of your folders.
Okay, fine. Fine, then I'll move this back down here.
There you go. Now we see it.
Okay, so I'm going to jump into issues in the second half of this, but I couldn't resist starting with one that's probably dear to many of your hearts, which is paid internships. Are you an intern? Are you a slave? Are you an employee? And there is a certain amount of hypocrisy of politicians demanding, here's a picture of Obama, fighting to raise a minimum wage to $15 an hour while they are employing interns that they are paying literally nothing. I did the math. For those of you who are in a 14-week semester, if you had gotten the lowest paying job in Washington, say working at a fast food restaurant, and it made minimum wage, you'd be making about $6,200 this term. Most of you are making nothing. Some of you may be making a fraction of that. And I don't say that to make you feel bad. I say that as a way of explaining what the value of an internship is. The Labor Department has very specific rules about this. Otherwise, McDonald's would say, hey, this is fantastic. Forget $14 minimum wage. We're going to hire a bunch of interns. Be a cashier intern, be a janitor intern. You can't do that because the Labor Department defines internships in specific ways. And the easiest way to understand what it says is that the intern is supposed to get more out of it than the employer. Okay, so McDonald's can't do this unless they are teaching more than they're getting out of you. So what that means is everyone who's employing you has an obligation to impart some knowledge on you, to share with you. And while some of your tasks will involve perhaps some menial things, and one of the great perks of doing this virtually instead of in person is they won't have you answering phones. They probably won't have you doing any kind of filing because you're not there physically. So it may be more substantive, but in general, they are supposed to be giving more than they're getting from you. So I always talk about, you've heard lots about what you're supposed to do at your internship. And, you know, I sum it up as exuding competence, be as competent as you can, play the Washington formality game until they give you permission not to. For those of you who watch The Office, I like to give sort of the basic summation, which is Dwight Schrute's "don't be an idiot" line. It doesn't want to play for me, that's okay. What Dwight Schrute said at one point is, before I do anything, I ask myself, would an idiot do that? The answer is yes, I do not do that thing. So that's pretty clear at an internship. I wanted to add one important ingredient that fits into what I was going to talk about, which is to do your research. It is absolutely critical that you read about the work that you're doing, partly because it makes you a better intern and partly because it makes it a much more fascinating term for you. Read like crazy. Again, when you're in college, you don't need to, although many of you do, read newspapers, online, follow the news carefully. Again, this is the currency of Washington. Partly my background is journalism, so I push this a lot, but partly this is what people will be talking about. And the more you read, the more interesting it gets. So for example, and I don't believe anybody in this group is interning with Dianne Feinstein, but you guys have known her your entire lives as the elderly, the senior senator from California. She has a very fascinating past. Any of you who've seen the movie Milk will know. I mean, she was president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and told reporters she was not going to run again. This is sort of like the city council, when suddenly this guy, Dan White, snuck in, who had been kicked off the board. He had quit the Board of Supervisors, was not going to get reappointed, snuck in through a basement of City Hall with a gun. He was a cop, went up to see the mayor, got a private meeting with the mayor, shot the mayor dead, George Moscone, crossed the hallway past Feinstein's office where she said, "Oh, Dan, could I talk to you?" And he said, "Not now, Dianne." He went to Harvey Milk, who was an openly gay supervisor's office, and murdered him. Feinstein went in and found Milk's dead body, put her finger on the pulse because her husband was a doctor. She knew that's what you do. Stuck her finger into a bullet hole. And the picture you see, I hope you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, is at that point, Supervisor Dianne Feinstein telling the media the mayor is dead, Harvey Milk is dead, and the chief suspect is former Supervisor Dan White. That's pretty dramatic. As a result of that, she became mayor because she was a head supervisor. She stayed in politics. She ran for governor, which was a job she always wanted, ended up senator. When you know that, it makes it a lot more interesting to see her around. Similarly, Barbara Lee, who I'm hoping she's committed to, she hasn't given us a date yet, to spend some time talking to you guys this term. She was a Cal in the Capitol, which is the summer program that Berkeley has of UCDC. She interned for Ron Dellums. She then got a job with Ron Dellums, became his chief of staff, and then she took over for Ron Dellums when he retired. This woman right here was at 57 years ago, the I Have a Dream speech, which was delivered by Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. She left early because she was going to get married in 10 days to San Franciscans she had met. This is her looking like you guys as a senior in college, probably not looking like you guys. This is her age. That's Nancy Pelosi. At that point, Nancy D'Alessandro, before she married Paul Pelosi, who was a Georgetown student she met. One of my favorite, because it's just fascinating, it's grueling, but stories, is about the woman who you see pictured in this up top. Leo Ryan was the congressman for the other part of San Francisco, the southern part, and he had heard reports that all these kids had gone to join Reverend Jones, who had a cult going in Guyana, and some of the parents wanted them to come home and hadn't heard from them. He went to visit them, and when he was there visiting, some of them, there were about 1,000 of them, passed a note saying, "Can we go home with you?" Like half a dozen. He said, "No problem." So they went back to the airfield to leave, and while they're waiting for a second plane to come, who could bring some of these young San Franciscans out with him, a group of people with machine guns from this cult, Jonestown, pulled up and sprayed them all with machine gun fire, killing the congressman, killing the journalists who were with him, killing a couple staff members. One woman, who you see in that picture, was shot in the stomach and crawled into the jungle and survived. The people with the machine guns returned to Jonestown, and that's when Jim Jones told everyone the time had come and had them all drink the Kool-Aid that led to the biggest mass suicide, or you could call it murder, in history, where over almost 1,000 people died that day. But she crawled through the jungle and was saved, and that's Representative Jackie Speer. And you look at that picture of her. She represents the district south of California. She now represents the same district that the dead congressman used to represent. She looks like a cookie cutter, bland Stepford politician in that picture to me. When you know that story about her, she's absolutely fascinating. And this is true for all of Washington. The more you know about it, the more interesting it gets. I know that a couple of you are working for Jared Huffman, and Jared Huffman does not have a murderous crawl through the jungle story to share that I know of. But you should make sure, this is just me typing into Google an hour ago, Jared Huffman, and hitting Google News. All these stories pop up. Set your Google alert to wherever your internship is. It's important when you're interning for somebody like a Jared Huffman that you know what he's been in the news for. The same is true with any group. I know one of you is at the National Immigration Forum. If you go to their webpage and you can see that, you can read all about their history, you can read about them in the news, which you of course should do. Go to the About page. It'll show you a staff roster. Go through the staff roster. If you looked at it carefully, you wouldn't see this in this roster, but if you Googled Ali Nouri, the president, for example, in UCDC, you would see he actually spoke at UCDC as a speaker last term, or the last time we had students, which was in the winter. And if you ever were to talk to him and you knew that, you could say, hey, I understand you came to UCDC, and make a connection. This next person on the list, Don Leister, I called up, used to work for Congresswoman Hilda Solis, used to be her chief of staff. She's a Californian. I went to the very bottom of the list and found this woman, Jacinta Ma, who's vice president of policy and advocacy, and see that she graduated from UC Berkeley. Okay, so again, if you're interning there, it's wonderful if you, first of all, it gives you an in to talk to her, and if you ever are dealing with her, she will relate to you, particularly if you're a fellow Berkeley grad, but even as a UC grad, she can relate to that. So do these things. If you're the State Department, which several of you are, start reading about who might be Secretary of State under President Biden. The big talk now is Susan Rice, or maybe Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, who's told people that it's his job if he wants it, which may or may not be true. This is going to be the talk of folks at the State Department. And the more you read about this stuff now, the more you're able to converse with people. So set up a Google alert. One of the things that's not obvious to people is this place called Congressional Research Service. It's a fantastic resource. It's CRS. You can Google things like CRS and DACA. And if you want to get to speed on DACA, they have tremendous reports, well-written, short, with executive summaries. It's a branch of the Library of Congress. Any member of Congress can ask them to do a report on anything. So just yesterday, as I was trying to explain to somebody what the Hatch Act was, I just typed in CRS and Hatch Act, and boom, there's a primer on the Hatch Act. And you can read that in many other places. And the Hatch Act is relevant because it bans government employees from using their workplace or while they are under government supervision from doing any political work. So for example, if you had the Secretary of Homeland Security involved in a swearing-in ceremony for immigrants during a political convention, which is exactly what happened last week, that would be seen by most people as a violation of the Hatch Act because it was used for convention political purposes. Now the White House says, oh, that was just a coincidence. We had no idea we were going to use it for that, which may be hard to believe. But the people who set the chairs on the White House lawn, these are White House, if they were White House employees, clear violation of the Hatch Act. You can learn this stuff by just reading, by just a moment on Google. So let me quickly jump into this primer on the federal government. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly. Students have no problem in the past when I've talked to them naming the 3 branches of government. There's more difficulty when I ask questions such as how many members serve in the House of Representatives? And because that interactive part isn't working, I'm going to fly through and we'll take some questions at the end instead. But the answer is 435. How many people in the Senate? There's 100, 2 from every state. California senators, I hope most of you know, are Feinstein and Harris. What state has the most members? California by far. How long is the senator's term? 6 years. House members' term, 2 years. I show you these because I ask my students these questions at the beginning of the term in an anonymous survey. The numbers, the percentages you see on the right, that's a typical response. This happens to be a class from about 1 year ago. but it's very typical. So only about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 knew how many members were in the House. Barely half could name both of the US senators. So don't feel bad if you couldn't do it. In Washington, you would need to know that stuff. And trust me, you would know this stuff if you spend a little bit of time here. And I'm guessing in your internships, most of you will have no doubt about these kind of things by the time you're finished. The legislative branch, and now I'm going to get into the quick civics mode. So there are 435 voting members. There also are members from places like Guam and Washington, D.C., and they treat them as members, but they're pretend members. They don't get a vote. They just get to give speeches and such. And the reason that there are 435 members in the House and 100 in the Senate is because of what they call the Great Compromise, when after the Revolutionary War was fought, the colonies agreed on this form of government because the small states, Delaware, places like that, said, well, every state has to have representation. Of course, every colony should get a vote. And the big states like Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia said, that's ridiculous. We have many more people than you do. We should get more votes. So they settled it by having two branches, two houses in the Congress, one that's representative of population and one that's 2 per state. I'm just going to fly through this. So right now, the House is divided with 232 Democrats and 198 Republicans. There's a Libertarian and 4 seats are vacant. And the Senate is 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents, one of which is Bernie Sanders, both of whom are essentially Democrats. So it's kind of a 53 to 47 split. If there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, the vice president breaks the tie. So it's always going to go Republican under the current administration. Is it fair? The answer is, of course, this isn't even close to fair. Take a look at some of these statistics. California has 2 senators with about 12% of the US population. Wyoming has 1/6 of 1% of the US population and also makes up 2% of the Senate. So Harris and Feinstein are no more powerful than senators from dinky little states, but that's the system that's set up. California does have more votes in the House. I'm going to fly again through this. Those are more pictures of Nancy Pelosi I have here because I wrote a book about Nancy Pelosi. That's her as a little girl. That's her, it looks like, on a date with Senator Kennedy going to the prom, which it's not. That's when Kennedy was senator, not president. Pelosi's father was a big shot. And when she was in high school, she got to meet the president. I'm going to fly through again this because we're not going to have a whole lot of time. These are all UC-DC folks who have made it into Congress themselves, which is always a fascinating thing. And I'm sure that the numbers of that will be expanding as time goes on. If you were born before this date, which I'm guessing that for all the students on this call, none of you were unless you're slightly older than the rest. If you were born then you can run for the House in the coming election, although it's too late for your filing deadline. But you have to be 30 years old. If you were born before that date, January 3rd in 1998, you can run in the next election. It's in the Constitution. Similarly, if you were 21 before January 3rd, 2019 is wrong. I'm sorry. You could run, that should say 1998. You can run for the Senate. I say that to lead you up to this. This guy is a fascinating history. This guy is one of only a couple people who was ever elected to the Senate, even though the Constitution says you have to be 30, at age 29. And the reason was he had a birthday after the election before the swearing in ceremony. So when he was sworn in, he was 30 years old. And, you know, I would ask, anybody know who that is? Any of the students know who that is? Don't anybody else answer, but I'm in a bad situation that I don't believe, and maybe somebody else can see the chat. I don't think I can see a chat while I'm on the share screen. So I don't know if anybody else can, but go ahead and type it in there. You'll get credit for later if you know who that is. The answer, and it's actually sort of a tragic story. The answer is that guy, Joe Biden. He was elected age 29. He's been around forever. The tragedy is that you see him here with his 2 sons. He, as a senator-elect after his election, before he was sworn in at age 30, And you've heard about this if you watch any of the convention. He was down in Washington looking at his new office, and his wife and his young daughter, who was a 6-month-old, and his 2 toddler children were in a horrible car accident. His wife and his baby were killed instantly. His 2 sons barely survived. They were in comas. They were close to death. They both lived. One is Bo, who went on to be the Attorney General for the state of Delaware. He died recently. The other is Hunter, who is now the object of Trump administration's complaints about Biden's corruption. But the only other person who was elected at that age was Ted Kennedy, who was also only 29, another tragic story. But in order for a bill to become law, it goes to the House, it goes to the Senate, they pass it, they agree on the exact terms of it, it goes to the president, and he signs it or doesn't sign it. And I say he signs it or doesn't sign it because, as you all know, we've had nothing but he as president. That will surely change in your lifetime. It will not change immediately. But I'm going to skip again the details of this. I want to jump to the executive branch for a moment. So President Trump explained to a group of high school students just about a year ago. He explained this. Article 2 of the Constitution said it's where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, which, if that were true, would make it a very simple system of government. And of course, it's not true. It lays out specifically what the president can do, and it is a limited set of powers. Very, very powerful. The president's cabinet, by the way, and that's the cabinet room. Just a small interesting fact. You might notice, if you can see my mouse, the president's chair is just a little bit higher than everybody else's. The president is elevated. And while it might sound like that's a gesture to President Trump's ego, that's not what it is. All presidents have done that. But this is a cabinet room right at the Oval Office where they meet. This is the president's cabinet. When you hear about the cabinet, they're talking about the secretaries of all the departments. Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasurer. The only one that's not called secretary is the Attorney General. That would, in a sense, be the Secretary of the Justice Department, who's called the Attorney General. This is also the line of succession if anything were to happen to the president. So if something were to happen to Trump, people know the vice president gets the job. If something would happen to both of them, it goes to the Speaker of the House. After the Speaker of the House, it goes to the Senate President pro tempore, which is traditionally the longest serving senator in the majority party. In this case, it would be Orrin Hatch. After that, it goes to the cabinet secretaries based on the order of the age of the department. So after that, the State Department was one of the original departments. So after that, the State Department secretary becomes president, and so on and so on. And it's all laid out carefully because something were to happen, which is why when they deliver a State of the Union address, where all the members of Congress are there, the Speaker is there, the Vice President is there, the Cabinet is there, they always hide a member away in a secret location. And there's this TV show, Designated Survivor, that's based on that. Just in case something were to blow up in there or something, there would still be somebody outside that building who would have the constitutional authority to be president. One sort of sad thing, if you look at that picture carefully, you can see Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was sleeping during that speech. That was during Obama's speech. She admitted that she had had a glass of wine and it made her sleepy and she slept through the speech. Which turns us to the judicial branch. Anybody want to, and again, actually, if a student wants to unmute themselves, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court?
Roberts.
There we go. Well done. That was you, Samantha, right? I think. Well done.
Yes.
Okay, well done. Chief Justice John Roberts, appointed by George W. Bush. This is the Supreme Court and the presidents that nominated them. Presidents do not appoint. Trump often talks about the people he appoints to the Supreme Court. Presidents nominate, and then they must be confirmed by the Senate. And right now, there are 5 people who are generally considered conservatives, and 4 that are considered liberals. That said, it doesn't always break this way. People say that elections don't matter. Two of these were nominated by President Trump. Had Hillary Clinton won the election, rather there being a 5-4 split on the court, there almost certainly would have been a 3-6 split. Liberals would have almost certainly had 6 people on the court, which would have probably had a dramatic difference on some rulings that had come down. One thing that always amazed me, they talk about diversity in the Supreme Court, and there are finally women and a Latina and an African American on the court, and that took decades or centuries. But this is always amazing to me. Look at this diversity for their education. Every single one of them went to Harvard or Yale for their law school, with one outlier, and that was Columbia Law School, which is hardly an outlier. That's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's only because her husband got a job, and she was at Harvard, but her husband got a job in New York, and she decided to move down with him and attend Columbia instead. So at some point, another UC person will break through. In the history of the court, Earl Warren is the only UC graduate to have ever served on the Supreme Court, and he was Chief Justice. He was former governor of California. There's a small but important point if you do any writing at your internship. Capital with an O is capitalized. That refers specifically to that building, the Capitol building. It is unrelated to, it just sounds a lot like the word capital, I mean the capital of the United States, which is a small c and an A. And very briefly, it's because Capitoline Hill in Rome was where the Roman legislature was, and the founding fathers loved that, so they decided to call our building the Capitol after Capitoline Hill. All other uses of capital with an A and not capitalized, money, markets, capital crimes, or you did not get to come to the nation's capital because of COVID. That would be with a small c. If you ever hear people talk about the Hill, they're talking about Capitol Hill. If you hear them talk about K Street, they're talking about lobbyists. Again, I know I'm flying through this. No reason for you to know all this. It's just good for you to know when you hear these terms to Google them. If you hear about the Beltway, people are very insulting, saying that's inside the Beltway thinking. That just refers to this freeway that goes around Washington, D.C., which was built in 1964. And once you're inside there, you're inside the Beltway. I'm going to fly through some issues and then open up some questions. The election of 2016 seems like it's old. I cannot tell you how much Washington remains in shock. Partly it's because, although Washington in government is very mixed in terms of politics, take a look at the number of people who voted in Washington, D.C. for Donald Trump. 4.1%. All right, Berkeley had less, but that's less than San Francisco, less than Los Angeles. It means that in Washington, D.C. itself, roughly 1 out of 25 residents voted for Donald Trump. He is not popular among the people who live here. And it's partly because it's a very Democratic city, it's a very African-American city, and Trump does very poorly with those groups. Trump promised, as he was elected, he was going to put Hillary Clinton in jail, he was going to ban Muslims from entering the country, he was going to deport all undocumented immigrants, and he would build a wall the entire length of the border that Mexico would pay for. Those were his most vocal promises. None of those things have happened, not one. On the other hand, there are a number of very important policies that have happened, from tax cuts down to Supreme Court nominees. It's been a very consequential 3.5 years, and this does not discuss any of the tone setting that the president does and the norms that have been changed. One of the things Trump does is, it's one thing to disagree with him on something like, say, the wall. You might think the wall is bigoted, sends a bad signal, but that's a political judgment. That's a matter of opinion. But he states a number of facts like this. A lot of things people don't understand is we sign more legislation than anybody. He said that a year into his office. Things like this are factual statements which are demonstrably wrong. You can just look it up. It's not even close. It's a number of bills signed in his first year. He's, in the last number of presidents, not first, but the last. And if you want to count pages of legislation, which would be silly, he's still not even first. And the reason I bring this up is because this deception that he does is not normal. It's not the way it's been. When I was your age, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And believe me, there was a huge ruckus among liberals. They hated his policies. He was a conservative governor from California. He had tear gas students as governor at Berkeley in the free speech movement. But these were policy disagreements. I'm not saying that everything that Reagan or Biden or Obama says is true, but there has never been anything like this before in my life in watching politics, like the Trump's ability or his willingness to just say things that are flat out wrong. Just because it's interesting to show, I revised this, which is why I'm flying over some from last term, and I've updated a lot. The last time we had students was in the winter. This was the big issue, was impeachment. I went through a whole thing. What are the rules for impeachment? That seems like ancient history. So instead, in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to fly through some of these issues. Election day is 62 days away from now. The first presidential debate, September 29th. We're excited. Take a look at presidential debate number 2 on October 15th. We just learned this morning, it was just announced, that the moderator for that debate is Steve Scully, who some of you may be taking a class with. I'm sorry, his elective is a quarter elective. So most of you are not taking his class, but he's been teaching with us for a while. We will almost certainly, he's agreed, so we will certainly get him to speak to us as a group, but he's going to be the moderator for that debate. He also, if you ever Google him and John Oliver, we'll see John Oliver's repeated thing about the most patient man on television, which is amusing. A couple very quick resources if you're into politics or if you want to get into it. There are these things called Electoral College calculators, which if you're obsessive, just Google, there are tons of them. This is one of my favorite because it's very interactive. I think it's from 270 to win, but there are hundreds of them. You can click on these states and change their colors from blue to red to undecided, and it'll automatically tell you how many electoral votes that would mean. So you can sit around and say, okay, if Trump wins in Ohio, but he loses in Florida. A quick way to sound like you know what you're talking about is to go to one of many political prognosticators, pundits. But this guy has a very strong reputation. Cook, Charlie Cook is his name. He does a Cook Political Report. It costs a fortune, but lobbyists and members of Congress all sign up for his newsletters. But for free, and if you go to his site, Cook Political Report, you'll get this up. And for free, you can get stuff that's probably about, sometimes it's a week old, sometimes it's 3 days old. It's still really valuable. And if you click on his ratings, you will find things like this. This is from this morning, and I think it's, actually, this was last updated July 23rd. This is what I get for being a non-paid customer, but it gives you a fascinating lay of the land. In his mind, these are the most toss-up states, the most undecided, complete toss-ups. These are the states that lean Republican, the ones that are solidly Republican, the one lean Democratic. He is not a fortune teller, and he's been wrong many times before, but he knows more than I do, and it's always useful to see what an expert, he interviews, he looks at different statistics. You can also, this is his chart for the Senate, by the way, the US Senate race. And he looks at these, for example, are Republican Senate seats up for re-election. These 6, he says, are complete toss-ups. There are no Democratic held seats that are toss-up. You can see that, well, anyways, that it's a great way to sort of know the lay of the land. I'm skipping over this part. I was going to talk about social justice. I'm going to give it very short shrift for a reason that it's not that it's not critical. And you take a look at some of these issues that I listed there. Police reform, use of federal force to break up protests, addressing institutional racism, slavery reparations. These are all huge issues which Congress could take up. They're not going to take up any of these while you're here. It's simply too divided and too close to an election for there to be any sort of coalition put together to do any of this stuff. So you may hear Democrats screaming for some of this stuff, but there's going to be no action on this simply because no one's willing to do this. If there is a Biden landslide and Democrats were to take over the House and the Senate, these are some of the issues that might be before the next Congress, but that won't be till January. I'm going to fly through a budget explanation real quick, partly to tell you that we're not broke. Everyone talks about the country is broke, and indeed we are I have the number here. We are $26 trillion in debt or something. There's a difference between that being broke. Broke are countries like Sierra Leone or countries like Tonga, where the abject poverty and the GDP is so low that kids are walking around with bloated stomachs. We have got resources in this country that no country in the history of the world has ever had. Now, we have a financial disparity. We tax at a low rate and we spend at a high rate. And the basic difference, as simplistic as this is, between Republicans, who people say are heartless and starve the poor, is the Republicans say, yeah, let's balance the budget by cutting spending. Democrats, those socialists, soak the rich Democrats that people complain about, they say, no, let's balance the budget by raising taxes. And of course, there are nuances all over. But that's a key distinction. Most of the fights in Washington have to do with lowering services versus raising taxes. The deficit, just as a quick reminder, a deficit is how much money is spent each year more than the country takes in, whereas a debt is the accumulation of each year's deficits. So it's easy for college students to think of it this way. A student who spends $20,000 a year for tuition, more than you receive in income, which many of you are in that position, has a deficit each year of $20,000. And after 4 years, you have accumulated 4 times 20,000, you have accumulated a $80,000 debt. As of 11:30 this morning, your time, the debt was at $26 trillion. And just to explain how big that is, Trump says he's worth $10 billion, which no one really believes, but that's what he says. If this were $10 billion, we put it down to that, it would take 26,071 Trumps to balance the budget. It's not something that any small group of individuals can do. It is roughly $79,000 every man, woman, and child is how much we're in debt. Is that a bad thing? Well, some people think it's horrible because it drives up interest rates. Some people think it's not a problem because we can keep borrowing. It feeds into a fight that will be going on in the backdrop over the next 6 weeks dramatically, and that's COVID relief. Democrats have pushed for $3 trillion more in COVID relief. Where would the money come from? Just add it to the deficit. Thank you, and your generation will pay it later on. It includes relief for the states, unemployment extensions, mortgage insurance, election security. Republicans have said $1 trillion, okay, not a penny more. And they agree on the unemployment. They agree on the rental and mortgage assistance. The big fight that will be in the background while you're interning is fighting over how much relief the states and the cities are going to get from the federal government and how much money is going to go to election security. Republicans say election security has nothing to do with COVID. Democrats argue, of course it does, because we need the post office to be functional for election day if it's going to be able to do it in the middle of a pandemic. That's a big fight that's going on. I'm going to fly over diversity and essentially sum up just so we can get some questions. You're welcome to ask about these. Read. Don't forget to go to the think tanks, to read about things. And I give the analogy of baseball all the time because I'm a baseball fan and I know all sorts of people who find it hideously boring, which it's not. But if you don't know anything about baseball, it is hideously boring to watch a baseball game. If you know the game well and you know the players and you know the backgrounds and you know the strategies, it's absolutely fascinating. Washington is the same. The more you absorb it over the next 10 weeks, 14 weeks, the more enjoyable and satisfactory your experience will be. And before I see if there are any questions as I turn this off, let me also point out that, and we've said this to you before, we're here to help you. I mean, really, we're here to answer your questions. And those of us in Washington who are used to seeing you face to face, we miss the fact that we're not going to see you face to face. You have questions about this? I'm easy to track down, so are other people. Find us and ask us. If you just can't understand, but your internship wants to know the difference between a civil servant and a political appointee, feel free to ask because we get great satisfaction out of at least being able to explain this, whether you're here or not. Okay, With that, and now I can see the chat, which I'm hope isn't filled with a bunch of people saying enough already, stop. It's not. But go ahead. If anybody has any questions, you could type them in. There are few enough of us here that if you want to just unmute yourself and ask them, I'm fine with that too. Surely somebody has a question. All right, so Sophia's asking about podcast recommendations. I'll give you a 10-second answer and then hope others will join in. I personally get frustrated with podcasts, so I don't spend a whole lot of time listening, except for I love the Daily, the New York Times Daily. It's not a roundup of news, but it's a 20-minute in-depth look, and I love that. That is right now the only one I listen to. Other folks, either on staff or anybody else, what are good political podcasts you listen to?
It's not specifically political. Hi, this is Shay Communications, but Jonathan Van Ness's Getting Curious podcast is a really good podcast that talks about various political issues and societal issues. We all know him from the Fab Five, Queer Eye, but he brings in a lot of experts, and the podcast helps talk about issues in a way that's very understandable to people. And definitely the Daily's great.
And if you're looking for straight information, I do recommend, if you're willing to read, Vox, that's not Fox, that's Vox, V-O-X, which is a tremendous online site. It does have a liberal leaning, but it explains very well, and it gives references. And I would also go to fact checkers. There's a fact checker at the Post who's very good. There's one that won a Pulitzer Prize that run by Pew down in Florida called factchecker.org, I believe. They fact check, and they also give you links so you can look this up themselves. So you don't have to say, well, Trump said this and Biden said that. It's easy to assess who's more accurate here.
Yeah, and to add, Vox also has their own podcast. I believe it's called Today Explained, and they usually pick one issue relevant to current events, and they do a really good deep dive into it. Recommend.
All right, well, if there, I'll give you another moment. I was going to tell, they say that the news will get obsessive in Washington, and the people who you work with will get obsessive about the election. And in part, it's because they're political junkies, and that's one of the reasons they do the work that they do. But it's also because their jobs, this is not just a entertainment for them, their jobs are dramatically affected. Those of you at the State Department, while much of the work won't change, some of these people are going to have brand new bosses if Biden is elected, not just the secretary, but all the undersecretaries and the deputy undersecretaries. It also means that there will be enormous turnover, so that if, for example, you're at the immigration advocacy group, if Democrats win control of the Senate, it suddenly means that Democrats run the committees in the Senate. If they run the committees, it means that the Judiciary Committee Immigration Subcommittee will get to expand its staff dramatically. That might create openings for people, such as people at your internships. It also means it's a wonderful time for you guys to be interning, because if you're looking for work in Washington, once the world returns to normal, which will happen, most of you, I know from experience, are Democrats or lean left. If there is a new Democratic administration or the Democrats take over in the Senate, it will lead to many more jobs for Democrats. And while you may not jump in as a Deputy Secretary of State, there is this ratcheting up of everybody, and suddenly there are more entry-level jobs available.
I'd also like to add, even if you aren't interning with a political organization, people in Washington, D.C. really do care about these elections. I got my start in DC working at a children's theater here, and we all cared about the election, and the day after it was fraught. So just based on how even the politics would affect theater and the arts going forward. So like, no matter where you are, especially in DC, politics does influence it.
which some people love and some people don't. And we're going to have, I see young Chen is asking, thank you, about my background in journalism and how you predict elections. You predict elections by reading polls, and with any luck, the polls are better than they were last time. It's important to point out that the national polls last time were accurate as could be. They had Hillary Clinton winning over Trump by about 1.5 points, and she beat Trump in terms of the national vote by about 1.5 points. They were dead on. The flaw was in the state polls, which were horrifically off. And there have been problems with those. And Shay, we're going to have, but you got to, we have a political chat that we're going to be having, which I think I'll be moderating explain that.
Yeah, so in the Slack group, a lot of you have already been invited, and some of the staff can link to it as well. But there'll be a Slack channel where you can discuss politics, or Mark can drop in articles or important questions or to discuss what's going on with the election. You know, we can even have like a debate live watch. I know some of us will be watching those anyway. So, you know, it'll be a good place to like talk about it and ask questions, and knowledgeable staff can drop in. You can give your own insight and your own thoughts, because your opinions do matter, and it is important to have your voices heard. So join the Slack, join the channel. I will at you all in there to make sure you're there. And it'll be a lot of fun.
We are also hoping that at some point on one of these Wednesday sessions to have Professor Ken Goldstein come and speak, who is also someone who works for CBS News and actually runs their polling center. So they're the ones on the evening of the election that make the calls for CBS. And so we're hoping to bring him in to talk about how that happens in the behind the scenes as well.
And of course, Steve Scully will probably be dropping in on a speaking session as well, hopefully before or after he moderates a debate.
And we also have commitments, but just not dates yet. So I almost hate to say it, but we do have commitments from Representative Barbara Lee and Representative Karen Bass to speak to you guys this fall. So I hope that happens, and we have high hopes of some big name people, but we can't say anything yet because nothing has been confirmed at all. And with that, is there future things you want to announce, Mike, before we?
No, I have a question for you though, Mark, that I think it would be interesting for the students. You have a background in journalism. You started in sports writing for the San Francisco Chronicle. You covered the '89 Quake. How did you go from sports, publishing a book about baseball parks about America? How'd you go from that to being into politics and talking on radios and whatnot about politics?
And actually, I did not really start in sports, except that in college, I was the college sports editor. So I went, I mean, when I graduated college in the Midwest, I did what any smart Midwesterner does and immediately moved to the Bay Area because it's nicer out there, and desperately looked for work. And I'd written for the school newspaper. I went to a teeny little school, unlike you guys. So it was easy to fall into. A sports editor for a term. I was a feature editor for a bit. And I looked everywhere for work. I've never been as poor as I was before. Ended up working at the Martinez News Gazette, which is a tiny little paper out in Martinez over the hills from Berkeley. Eventually started freelancing for the Chronicle. That worked well. Came to Washington when the opening was there, became bureau chief. And I mean, it's a long story. And I always had an interest in current events, but really it wasn't until my junior year of college that even occurred to me that I would do journalism. That just never, and I was a psychology major, and essentially you needed to get an advanced degree to do anything in psychology. And back then, and sort of now, you don't need a degree in journalism. So I just plowed on. But I guess, I mean, my big, and you'll hear this from all the speakers that we have who talk about their careers, is don't assume anything right now. Keep your minds open to whatever might, fascinate you, because some of the stuff that I've been blathering about here, that, I mean, I never would have had any interest on deficit and debt and that kind of thing, but it all builds. And, 40 years from now, when you're talking to kids who have not even been born yet, and you're talking to them about I'd say the Kamala Harris presidency, God forbid the Donald Trump Jr. presidency, but you'll have seen this stuff firsthand. And they'll think of you as an old relic when you tell them, oh, there's a guy named Jared Huffman I interned for. But keep your eyes open, because you really, even though it's virtual, you are still able to have inside access and see things that most of the country is not able to do. And I think we are out of time. Is that right? I'd be more than happy to stick around if anybody wants to ask anything more. But do you guys have any announcements about future events or?
Young Chan, if you're still on the call, do you want to quickly just plug next week's session?
Hello, everyone. I'm Young Chan, part of Student Services. And next week, I am going to invite a UC and UCDC alumni, and the both of us, and a Student Services Director, Debbie Dees. We will be talking about issues of navigating diversity in the workplace in the internet space. So I hope you can join us. Please ask us questions. We'll be looking forward to your participation next week, same time, 12 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you.
And thank you, Mark.
Yes. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. We'll see you soon.